Most people would have seen this old plantation portrait and moved on in under 5 seconds. Wealthy Southern family, fine clothes, formal pose, children arranged like decorations, enslaved workers standing in the background as if they were part of the furniture. The whole image looked like exactly what it was meant to look like in the 1850s, a performance of power, order, and control. But one woman in that photograph was holding something she was never supposed to be holding. And once somebody noticed it, the entire picture changed sides. In the spring of 2023, Dr. Eleanor Price was sorting a group of uncatalogued 19th century photographs at a historical archive in Richmond. Most of them were what you'd expect: faded portraits, cracked cases, family images with no names attached. The kind of material that matters deeply to historians but rarely produces a shock. Then she opened a plate marked only with a studio stamp from Petersburg and a date, July 1858. The image showed the Whitlock family of Eastern Virginia posed on the front steps of a large house. Nathaniel Whitlock sat in the middle with the stiff confidence of a man used to owning everything in his line of sight. His wife sat beside him. 3 children were arranged around them in carefully chosen clothes. Behind them stood 5 enslaved house servants in dark formal dress, placed just far enough back to signal status without appearing equal to the family. Eleanor had seen dozens of photographs like it. Then she looked at the woman standing on the far right. Her body angle was slightly off from the others, not enough to look clumsy, but enough to feel deliberate. Her face was turned just a little too directly toward the camera, and her right hand, half hidden in the folds of her dress, seemed to be holding something. Eleanor moved the plate beneath a magnifying lens and felt her pulse kick. It was paper, folded small, gripped tightly, positioned just enough to be caught by the camera but not enough to draw attention from anyone glancing at the image casually. Folded small, gripped tightly, positioned just enough to be caught by the camera but not enough to draw attention from anyone glancing at the image casually. She checked twice to make sure it wasn't a shadow or a crack or some chemical flaw in the old surface. It wasn't. It was there. A folded piece of paper in the hand of an enslaved woman standing in a formal plantation portrait from 1858. That should not have been possible. Photographs like that were controlled down to the inch. Every person was placed. Every hand was arranged. Every object was part of the message the family wanted to send. Enslaved people in those images were not supposed to appear as individuals with intention. They were supposed to function as background proof of wealth, which meant if that paper made it into the image, it was there because somebody wanted it there. Eleanor spent the rest of the day comparing the portrait to others from the same photographer. Nothing like it turned up. No hidden objects, no unusual servant poses, no accidental intrusions. This one was different. The next morning, she started on the Whitlocks. Property records showed that Nathaniel Whitlock owned a tobacco estate outside Petersburg and held dozens of enslaved people in 1858. He was active in local politics, well-connected, and the kind of man who believed the social order existed for his benefit. The photographer, Elias Hartwell, had a ledger that confirmed the sitting date, July 19th, 1858. So Eleanor now had the who and when. What she needed was the why. She found the first break in Whitlock family papers preserved in a Richmond collection. Most of the documents were exactly what you'd expect from a man like him. Crop accounts, purchase orders, letters about shipments and credit. Human beings reduced to line items and value. Then, in a letter written a few weeks after the photograph, Whitlock told his brother that several house servants had become unsettled by dangerous notions, and that restrictions had been tightened inside the home. That phrase mattered. Dangerous notions. Not theft, not violence, ideas. Then came the second break. A rushed sale document from September 1858 showed that 3 enslaved women had been sold south to a buyer in Louisiana. The price was low for the market, too low. It looked less like a business choice and more like a removal. One of those women, Eleanor suspected, was the woman from the photograph. The first actual name came from a descendant. Marion Whitlock, an elderly relative living in the Fan district, agreed to meet after Eleanor explained what she'd found. In fact, she seemed tired of the old silences around it. When Eleanor showed her the plantation portrait, Marion went still almost immediately. "My grandmother once mentioned a woman named Lydia," she said. "A house servant who could read. They said she frightened Nathaniel because she knew too much." Then Marion brought out a family journal. It had belonged to Nathaniel Whitlock's wife, Sarah. The entries were short, restrained, and full of the kind of emotional censorship women were expected to practice in that world. But one entry from July 1858 mentioned the portrait sitting and noted that Lydia had stood with strange firmness. Another from September recorded that Lydia and 2 others had been sold because Nathaniel believed they had been corrupted by abolitionist influence. Eleanor closed the journal and just sat there for a second. Now the photograph had a name, Lydia. From there, the whole story moved faster. Eleanor contacted a historian of resistance networks in the Upper South, Dr. Isaiah Cole, who took one look at the enhanced image and said what she was already starting to suspect. The folded paper was likely not just any note. It was probably a message, maybe even a route document. In 1858, free black communities, literate enslaved workers, Quaker contacts, church networks, and river laborers were all part of fragile but real chains of communication. House servants, especially those who moved between rooms, visitors, and errands, sometimes had access to information others didn't. That meant Lydia may not have just been literate. She may have been dangerous in the most feared way possible, connected. The paper in her hand became the center of the investigation. Eleanor arranged multispectral imaging through a university lab, hoping the folds and ink traces would yield something more. The results were not clean, but they were enough to turn suspicion into something much stronger. Not full sentences, not beautifully preserved text, but definite signs of a rough map, a branching route, a cluster of symbols, one star-like mark next to what appeared to be initials. Another set of letters repeated near the lower fold. Isaiah compared the markings to known Underground Railroad codes used in scattered documents from Virginia and Maryland. The resemblance was chilling. She was holding a contact map, he said quietly, right there in the portrait. That idea is still hard to wrap your mind around. In the middle of a plantation image designed to celebrate ownership, Lydia had managed to slip evidence of a resistance network into the frame itself, not in a diary hidden under a floorboard, not in a letter that could be burned. In a formal photograph, the one place her enslavers would never think to inspect closely. Another, from September, recorded that Lydia and 2 others had been sold because Nathaniel believed they had been corrupted by abolitionist influence. Eleanor's next stop was Louisiana. In March 1859, a parish report recorded that one of the Virginia women had escaped. One of them, age about 33, was described in a notarial note as literate and troublesome in disposition. That sort of phrasing tells you almost everything. It meant she thought, remembered, and likely resisted. Then came the detail that made Eleanor sit forward so fast her chair scraped the floor. In March 1859, a parish report recorded that one of the Virginia women had escaped. She was described as intelligent, resourceful, and unlikely to travel alone. No capture record followed. Lydia had gotten out, but that was not the end of it. Abolitionist correspondents in Philadelphia and Iowa produced scattered references to a woman from Virginia who came north through Gulf routes in 1859, carrying valuable knowledge of plantation households and urban contacts. One letter described her as educated, determined, and unwilling to remain in safety while others were still trapped. Another suggested she intended to move back toward Virginia, not away from it. That part gets under your skin. Most people who escaped had every reason to keep going, to disappear into distance and never look back. But the paper trail suggested Lydia did something almost impossible. She returned. By late 1859 and into 1860, small references began appearing in records connected to anti-slavery networks around Richmond and Petersburg. A woman with inside knowledge of elite households, a conductor who could move information quietly. A contact who knew which roads were watched, which homes were sympathetic, and which enslavers kept their guard down when they felt secure. Then Eleanor found the document that brought the whole thing together. A report filed in 1861 by a local Confederate-aligned official complained of an escaped woman formerly connected to the Whitlock estate, who had reappeared in the region and was suspected of helping enslaved people flee. The handwriting on the note matched Nathaniel Whitlock's correspondence. Even after selling Lydia south, he was still trying to get rid of her shadow, and still failing. The final trace came after the war. A Union record from 1865, filed after federal control expanded in Richmond, mentioned an interview with a woman named Lydia who said she had worked as a guide and courier during the war years, helping move people, messages, and information through the region. The clerk called her remarkably capable. That dry little phrase may be the most frustrating thing in the whole file. Remarkably capable, as if that even begins to cover it. Lydia had been enslaved on a Virginia plantation, taught herself to read, built or joined a resistance network, inserted a map into a formal portrait, was sold south as punishment, escaped Louisiana, and then returned to enemy ground to help other people get free. All while the men who claimed to own her believed they understood the world better than she did. That plantation portrait was supposed to be a monument to Whitlock power. Instead, it became Lydia's document. When the image was finally exhibited with its new research, descendants from both sides came to see it. Some came with shame. Some came with grief. Some came with family stories they had never been able to verify. One man, whose ancestor escaped from the Richmond area in 1861, stood in front of Lydia's image for a long time before saying, "So that's who opened the door." That line stayed with Eleanor, because that is what the photograph reveals now. Not passive suffering frozen in time, but active resistance hiding inside the frame. Lydia was not just there to be seen as property, she was there leaving evidence. Quiet, precise, and brave enough to trust that one day someone might look closely enough to understand what she had done. And that may be the most unsettling part of all. Not just that she resisted, but that she found a way to preserve the resistance inside a portrait built to erase her. So now when people stop in front of that old plantation photograph, they don't stay focused on the Whitlocks for very long. Their eyes drift where they should. To the woman on the right, to the hand, to the folded paper, to the small rebellion that outlived the people who tried to bury it. And once you see that, the whole image turns inside out. It is no longer a record of ownership. It is a record of defiance. And it leaves one question hanging in the air long after you walk away. If Lydia was bold enough to hide a map in plain sight inside a plantation portrait in 1858, how many other photographs from that world are still sitting in boxes and archives, waiting for somebody to look hard enough to realize the people in the background were never just standing there at all?